Chapter 4. Their first exposure to the upper plateau, well after the noon hour the following day, amply bore out these fears. After an early night the evening before, they had made a slightly later start than they had hoped for. Not only did they linger longer than planned over the delicious breakfast that Dee had prepared to send them off with, but packing up and loading the panniers on the pack horses took longer than anticipated, not least because Ora kept finding items that he thought they should take, and also kept giving them last-minute advice. "Do not be tempted to skip any of the huts and push on," he warned. "They are really positioned at the maximum distances apart that you can realistically expect to cover in a day." So it was well into the morning when they finally took their cordial leave from the helpful caretaker and his wife and son, and started the ascent of the steep and winding pass that led up to the upper plateau. Though they had woken to a fairly pleasant morning, without the almost constant wind that they had had to contend with for most of their journey, and with even some slight warmth in the welcome sunshine, the temperature started dropping steadily as they wended their way up the precipitous incline. Fortunately, the track was reasonably level, which made it easier for the horses. Lhounds instructed Zan to lead the way, which he did with his usual smooth and effortless lope. The fall in temperature was further exacerbated by the usual freezing wind that had also sprung up again, and which increased markedly in strength the higher they climbed. This became so noticeable that Lhounds called a halt about halfway up the pass, so that they could raise the hoods of their undershirts and put their heavier cloaks on. He also made sure that they all had their eye shields conveniently to hand. Then they resumed the arduous climb to the top of the pass. It was getting ever colder as they climbed. The last and steepest part of the pass snaked its way through a deep cutting with high unbroken rock walls on either side of them that shielded them from the wind. So it was only as they stepped out of this brief shelter onto the completely level expanse of the upper plateau that it gave them an unambiguous indication of its destructive capacities. The wind abruptly sharpened to what was virtually a gale, and almost immediately there were light snowflakes swirling around them. The temperature abruptly plummeted even further. The horses snorted in protest, and Zan projected a mind sense strongly tinged with aversion. "We must get on," Lhounds said tersely. So the three humans hurriedly put their snow shields on and tightened the hoods of their cloaks and the wristbands of their gloves. Then they settled the nervous horses into a steady trot. Zan kept pace with them in his usual position, to the right and just slightly ahead of Lhounds and Shadow. Lhounds had the lead of the one pack horse clipped onto Shadow's saddle, while the other pack horse's lead was fastened to Racer's saddle. As the horses' steady pace ate up the parsecs and everybody warmed up slightly with the movement, the initial shock of their abrupt exposure to the upper plateau's weather abated somewhat, as they all strove to come to terms with the extreme conditions. Lhounds had never in his life seen a flatter terrain. On both sides of the arrow-straight track, the landscape stretched out in parsec after parsec of almost featureless stony bleakness and unbroken grey-brown monotony, sight only limited by the haze that obscured the far distances. The only colour in the essentially colourless expanse was provided by the red and black posts set at regular intervals along the side of the track. There was as yet only a light dusting of snow on the track, so the horses' footing remained uncompromised. As the afternoon wore on, the snow stopped completely, and there was even the occasional fitful gleam of slanting sunshine, though the wind maintained its merciless assault relentlessly as the day drew in. For some time Lhounds had been aware of a growing sense of fatigue and hunger that he was subliminally aware was shared by everybody, horses and humans alike. They had all been so anxious to get the first part of their upper plateau crossing behind them that they had not stopped to eat all day, and had only watered the horses briefly before they reached the top of the pass. Lhounds was reluctant to do so now, as he was very concerned about the chilling effect of the wind on the horses if they stopped moving. He was, however, just starting to think that they would have no choice but to stop soon, when to his intense relief, Zan, with his extremely keen vision, sent, "But getting close," though Lhounds could not yet see it. Soon, however, the squat shape of the hut became visible in the far distance. With a feeling of intense relief, they reached it some minutes later. Lhounds dismounted and undid the latch on the big wooden door, then led the way inside and hurriedly shut the door behind them. Their first and immediate impression was one almost of warmth, so overwhelming was the relief to be out of the searing, energy-sapping blast of the wind. It took some moments for their eyes to become accustomed to the gloom inside the hut, as there were only 2 small windows. The bamboo hut was fairly large and rectangular in shape. One end was obviously equipped for horses, with several feeding in water troughs against the wall. There was a large pile of reasonably fresh-looking straw in one corner, and a smaller pile of hay in the other. The other side of the hut contained some shelves, 4 sets of narrow wooden bunk beds and mattresses, and a large table with a single oil lamp hanging above it. There were 2 long benches on either side of the table. A large fireplace was incorporated in the stone end wall, which was the only part of the hut not made of either bamboo or wood. The fireplace was fitted with a heavy cooking grid and some hooks above it. On one side of the fireplace, a substantial amount of firewood was stacked against the wall. The other corner was screened off and proved to be equipped with rudimentary ablution facilities. And right in the middle of the hut was a well, supplied with a wooden bucket on a rope and winding gear and handle. Though the hut was very cold, it seemed neat and clean, despite some used straw on the floor in front of one of the feeding troughs and some spent ashes in the hearth. All in all, the travellers were not displeased with their modest but certainly adequate shelter. As they all helped to lift the panniers off the pack horses and began unpacking their supplies, Lhounds asked Dane to get the fire made and start heating some water, while he and Anmar took care of the horses. By the time the horses had been unsaddled, wiped down with handfuls of straw, and then warmly covered with their blankets, Dane came to help with their feeding and watering, as he had managed to get a good fire going, which was already starting to disperse just the merest hint of warmth through the frigid air. Their largest pot full of water was set on the cooking grid to heat up, as was Lhounds' kettle, similarly filled with water from the well. Whilst unpacking, Anmar had placed a large packet containing a dried vegetable and elk meat stew mix on the table to prepare for their supper. When soon afterwards Zand indicated to Lhounds that he wanted to go outside to look around, maybe hunt. And when Lhounds briefly went outside with him, he discovered that full night had already fallen. He was also shocked anew at how cold it was getting and hurried back into the hut, which was now much warmer than the freezing conditions outside. The rest of the evening passed in preparing and eating supper, keeping the fire replenished and giving the horses more water and fodder. Not too much, Lhounds warned. We do not want them to get colic. After some time, Zand sent a disgruntled, "Nothing out here! Let me in!" A frigid gust of wind accompanied the Lhounds' entrance, making them very grateful for the shelter that the hut afforded. Having not been able to find any prey outside,
should be snow time again out there,
Zand dispatched the remainder of the elk stew with just the merest hint of resignation. After having cleaned up the cooking area and washed their small number of dishes, they all went to bed early after some rather cursory ablutions and a final mug of steaming herb and honey tea. Everybody cocooned themselves warmly in their cloaks and new twill blankets. Zand stretched out next to the newly stoked fire. "Zand, wake me for an early start tomorrow," Lhounds signaled just before drifting into sleep. He received a muted mind nod from the Lhound. It was therefore still fully dark when Lhounds awoke the next morning in the now chilly hut as a result of an insistent mind nudge from Zand. As he woke the others and then walked across to feed the horses, Lhounds said, "I don't think we should make a fire again this morning. We don't want to leave any coals in here and create even the slightest risk of setting fire to the hut." Dane, who was engaged in getting water from the well for the horses, agreed. "Absolutely," he said. "These huts surely literally mean the difference between life and death up here." Both men would remember these prophetic words with the utmost clarity in the very near future. The travellers therefore only had a breakfast of meal cakes, lenderberry preserve, and cold leftover herb tea. Zand chewed on a meal cake without any noticeable enthusiasm. Afterwards they filled the water flagons, packed up, tidied the hut, and saddled the horses. And then they were on their way. It was, if anything, even colder than the day before. Except for 2 brief stops to give the horses some water and high-energy nuggets, and to have some honey cakes and water themselves, the day passed in much the same fashion as the previous one. In the late afternoon the wind abated, and it seemed to get marginally warmer. Their relief at this was short-lived, however, as the light snow, which had fallen intermittently throughout the day, started coming down more heavily. By the time they reached the next hut, in the heavy dusk of an early nightfall, the sound of the horses' hooves was starting to be muffled by the build-up of snow on the track. As had been the case the evening before, the hut, essentially exactly the same as the previous one, offered them a secure and welcome refuge from the elements. The evening and night passed in much the same fashion as the night and evening before. Their accumulated tiredness after the 2 days' hard travelling and the early start that morning made them sleep later the next morning. So, it was full daylight the next day that presented them with a world beautifully and dramatically transformed. Instead of the grey-brown stony bleakness their eyes had become accustomed to, pristinely white snowfields stretched as far as they could see. The snow had stopped, and even more miraculously, The wind had died down, and bright sunshine made the transformation even more startling. The purpose of the posts at the side of the track now became abundantly clear. Against the unbroken whiteness, the vivid red and black of these posts stood out with great clarity, and in many places were the only indication of where the track went. Lhounds crouched down to test the depth and consistency of the snow on the track, and found to his relief that it was quite dry and not too thick. "I do not think that we need to rub shale oil grease inside the horses' hooves yet," he said to Anmar and Dane as he straightened up. "I doubt that this will clog their hooves." Dane nodded. "I'll keep some handy, though," he promised. Though it was still very cold, the air had such a crisp and energizing quality to it that their journey that day acquired an almost celebratory aspect, as their now beautiful and sunlit surroundings, and the welcome absence of the wind, contributed to a general feeling of positivity and well-being. They were also relieved that their crossing of the plateau, the prospect of which had filled them all with varying degrees of unease, was going so well. They set a good pace, as the layer of snow, instead of compromising the horses' footing, actually made the going marginally easier on the hard track. And though the wind started blowing again towards the end of the afternoon, their cheerful mood was still with them as they reached the next hut well before nightfall. That evening their eventide meal in the fire-warmed hut became quite a festive affair. Not only did that day's reconstituted stew mix of terre goose, dwarf onions, and forest mushrooms prove unexpectedly delicious, Zand approved enthusiastically, but Dane produced a small flask of sweet apple wine as a delicious accompaniment to it. The next day unfortunately presented very different conditions to the previous one. Lhounds heard the keening whistle of the wind outside the moment he woke up. The hut seemed markedly colder than the morning before, and predictably conditions outside proved extremely unpleasant. Not only was the wind blowing with renewed ferocity, but dark and lowering skies presented a telling contrast to the previous day's sunshine, and also promised more snow, if not sleet, before the end of the day. So it was a decidedly less buoyant company than the morning before that braced themselves for a hard day as they set off into the grey morning. Dane expressed their feelings perfectly when he grumbled, "Bloody plateau just softened us up by being nice yesterday so it could kick us in the teeth today." And as the taxing day wore on, conditions did not improve. The wind did not let up for a single instant, taxing animal and human endurance to what they thought was the absolute limit. After their brief noon-hour stop for food and water, stinging needles of sleet in the wind started adding to their misery. The afternoon seemed to pass with agonizing slowness as they all longed passionately for the shelter of the next hut, as the exhausting conditions took their toll. But far worse was to come. It was in the early dusk of late afternoon, when they were all starting to strain their eyes for the first welcome glimpse of the next hut, that Zand abruptly flung an urgent, "I smell smoke!" into the weary minds of the three humans. As they all battled with a sense of disbelief whilst striving to come to grips with the implications of the Lhounds' mind-send, Zand set off in a flat-out run that almost immediately took him beyond the reach of their tired eyes as he disappeared into the deepening murk of early evening. After a stunned moment, Lhounds called out, "I'm going to see what's going on," and Shadow leapt forward in pursuit of the Lhound. Only Anmar and Nightwind sped after him, as Dane was forced to match Racer's pace to the pack horses. After Lhounds and Shadow had covered about a parsec at speed, they met the Lhound racing back towards them. As Lhounds pulled Shadow up next to the panting animal, Zand raised inscrutable eyes to his face and sent, "The hut has been burnt down." The sending had a curious flat quality that Lhounds knew from experience masked intense banked-down emotion. When Anmar drew level with them and pulled Nightwind up, Lhounds said in a shocked voice, "Zand says the hut has been burnt down." Anmar responded, "I know, I heard." The humans exchanged appalled glances with each other and the lion-hound. Then Zand mind spoke again. "It was deliberate, strong smell of chem oil everywhere." This time suppressed fury flickered even more strongly under the words of his sending. The two humans and three animals were still standing in the same place in the immobility of utter dismay when Dane and the other horses caught up with them. When they told him the dreadful news that somebody had deliberately destroyed the hut, the expression on Dane's face mirrored their own feelings of appalled shock. Then he cried out in a horrified voice as the full implications of the loss of the hut sank in. "But we cannot possibly survive a whole night up here without shelter. We'll be dead before morning." Lhounds responded grimly, "I rather suspect that is the idea. Somehow, somebody, don't ask me how, found out that we are going to Gordofane on a mission, and they do not want us to get there." Then he continued, as steely determination crept into his voice, "But I swear, by Grellan, that I will not let them stop us. We will get there. Come, let's get to the hut. Maybe there is still some shelter to be had there." He turned Shadow's head into the direction of the hut and set off at a fast pace. As everybody scrambled to catch up with him, he derived some comfort from seeing the powerful shape of the Lound, keeping pace with him and Shadow in his accustomed place, slightly ahead and to the right of them. "Zand?" he queried. "Anything left of the hut?" Zand's response was terse and to the point.
"Only the end wall standing."
Leonard absorbed the grim news in mental silence. When they reached the hut shortly hereafter, their worst fears were confirmed. Apart from the stone-built end wall and the low stone wall around the well, literally nothing else was left of the wood and bamboo walls. Even the wooden bucket and winding gear of the well were reduced to ash. Fighting down his disappointment and rising near panic, Leonard started to issue brisk instructions. "Dane, help me get these panniers off the pack horses. Anmar, will you get the horse blankets out as quickly as you can, please? Also that bag of nuggets for them. We have to get these horses covered and watered and fed as soon as possible." They led the horses right up against the wall in the hope of providing them with some shelter from the wind, got the horse blankets over them, and then herded them close together for warmth. Then they used a rope from Leonard's pack and their biggest cooking pot to haul up some water from the well. The horses drank greedily, then each ate a large handful of the high-energy nuggets from the humans' hands. Afterwards the humans slaked their thirst as well. Dane refilled their water flagons, and Anmar got some honey cakes out for them. And then, having piled on every spare item of clothing that they had, and spreading their blankets over both themselves and their horses, humans and horses huddled closely together in the lee of the wall. And at first, Leonard thought that they would indeed be able to wait out the night like that. Initially, the big bodies of the horses produced generous amounts of warmth, and behind him the solid body of the Lound shielded both him and Anmar to some extent. But the direction of the wind kept changing, causing icy blasts to swirl viciously around and between them, dispersing what little warmth they had been able to build up. Soon the horses were no longer generating much warmth. Leonard gradually felt colder and colder, and then, blissfully, he started feeling a wonderfully warm lassitude creeping over him. Then Zan's mind knifed into his.
"Leonard, wake up! Anmar, we are getting too cold. We must move. Wake up!"
Irritably, the big man tried to push the Lound sending away, but Zan would not give up, now physically pushing against Leonard's back as well. And as Leonard came to himself again, he realized that the Lound was right, and that they were coming perilously close to succumbing to the cold. At his side, Anmar was already stirring, having been jolted awake by the Lound's insistence. Leonard reached out and roughly shook Dane. "We have to get moving," he called out, "or we're going to freeze to death here." Once fully conscious again, both Anmar and Dane responded with alacrity. They left the horse blankets on the horses, and within minutes had got them saddled and the panniers back on the pack horses, that they had also covered with 2 of their own blankets. "Now we must ride and get ourselves and these horses warmed up." Leonard guided Shadow onto the track. "Lead, Zand," he instructed, and Zand immediately moved into position in front of the big mare. "And now we run for our lives," Leonard shouted. As they all settled into the steady pace that the lion-hound set, he hoped fervently that they would all, animals and humans alike, see the new day. The rest of that night's journey assumed such a nightmarish quality that none of them would ever find it easy to talk about, or were able to describe it with any degree of clarity or coherence. It in essence became a terrifying memory of images and sense impressions, beyond the reach of the logic and the order of language. 2 elements predominated: the overwhelming, consuming, inimical, ever-present cold, exacerbated almost literally beyond endurance by the freezing wind, and a sense of such exhaustion as would later be impossible to recall clearly, let alone describe adequately. They would ride until one or more of the horses seemed too spent to continue, then stop, give the horses a little water and a few nuggets, then rest a while until the vicious cold made it imperative that they move again. This pattern repeated itself at ever shorter intervals throughout that night, and looming large in the minds of the 3 humans and in Zan's, though none of them shared it with the others that night, was the constant fear that the next hut would also have been destroyed, and that their desperate struggle to continue would lead not to safety, but to inevitable death. The smaller of the 2 pack horses died about 8 hours into their journey. Dane had just called out to Leonard that they had to stop because the pack horses were struggling, when the little mare simply lay down, quite gently, on the icy ground and died. By the time Lhounds got down from Shadow, there was no heartbeat. They got the blankets and the almost empty panniers off her and distributed the contents among their saddlebags. Then they did the same with the panniers of the other pack-horse in an attempt to help him. As he was shivering, they put the horse blanket and extra blanket from the little mare on him as well, and gave him another handful of nuggets and a bit of water. As 2 of their water flagons were empty by now, they laboriously filled them with snow with the aid of a spoon, then hung one on Shadow and the other on Racer, hoping that the warmth of the horses' bodies would melt the snow to augment their dwindling water supply. When they set off again, Zan remained standing beside the track. Lhounds gave him a brief look and nodded. He knew that the hungry Lound would feed on the dead horse and catch up with him afterwards. Half an hour later, the Lionhound was back in position ahead of Shadow. Lhounds exchanged his usual comforting mind greeting with him, though it was underlaid with the grim realization of their dire circumstances. And somehow the night passed along with the rest of their nightmare journey. But the time came, in the deepest darkness that according to the old saying precedes the dawn, that Lhounds knew that they had all, humans and animals alike, passed far beyond the limits of normal endurance and were perilously close to the end. Their pace had fallen to a dull, almost comatose plod, when Lhounds felt a surge of powerful mind energy from the Lound that swept through the whole party. Shadow lifted her head, and Nightwind actually wickered as if waking from sleep. All 3 riders straightened up in their saddles, and the flagging horses picked up their pace significantly, and somehow the Lound kept up this mind-send of warmth and encouragement and vigor for the next hour, keeping them going, imbuing them all with his strength and indomitable will to survive, though Lhounds, knowing the psychic cost of such a sustained sending, could not even imagine what it cost the Lound. He sent a heartfelt acknowledgement of debt to the little pack-horse whose death had served to partly re-energize Zand, and now enabled him, in turn, to help them. And then, miraculously, incredibly, utterly unbelievably, a squat shape solidified in the grey darkness in front of them. They had reached the hut, and even more miraculously, it seemed intact. The relief of being inside the hut and out of the wind, with the heavy bamboo door securely bolted behind them, was indescribable. For a few long moments, everybody just stood leaning against their horses, and allowing the knowledge that they had survived and were actually safe to wash over them. Lhounds, wedged between Shadow and Zand, who uncharacteristically was leaning with almost his full weight against the man, straightened up first. Taking a deep breath, he said, "Let's get organized before we all fall over." As they all moved into their by now accustomed routines, Lhounds briefly probed Zand's mind, then, horrified at the Lound's level of psychic exhaustion, sent an urgently peremptory command to him. "Zand, lie down," as he quickly flung a mattress from one of the beds onto the floor to one side of the fireplace. As the Lound almost literally collapsed onto it, Lhounds covered him with a blanket hastily pulled from the pack-horse. Anmar, having clearly picked up the sending and the reason for Lhounds' agitation, was there almost immediately with a bowl of water, into which she had crumbled 3 honey cakes. As Anmar held the bowl, the Lound clumsily lapped up the contents, while Lhounds, kneeling on the mattress, supported the animal's bulky shoulder and head against his hip and the side of his knee. "Now sleep," he instructed, as the Lound stretched out prone on the mattress. Lhounds remained in his kneeling position next to Zand, and kept his head on the massive chest until the erratic thumping of the heart slowed into a somewhat more regular rhythm, and the exhausted mind slid away from his into the utter blackness of profound sleep. Still kneeling on each side of the sleeping Lionhound, Anmar and Lhounds exchanged shocked glances. "He nearly killed himself keeping us and the horses going," Anmar said in an awed whisper, then added contritely, "I am ashamed of myself. I should have tried to help, but I was just so tired." Lhounds nodded. "I feel the same, but I do not think that any of us could have done much. In fact, I know we couldn't. We were all beyond the limits of our endurance." Laboriously rising to his feet, he extended a hand to Anmar and pulled her up as well. Shaking his head, he gave her a crooked little smile. "And that is about the limit of what I am capable of now," he said. "I doubt that I could even manage that," said Anmar, and smiled wearily in return. And yet, of course, they did. Very soon a roaring fire was starting to dispel the deep cold from the hut. The weary horses had all been fed and watered, unsaddled, rubbed down, and recovered with their horse blankets, and an extra blanket each. To the humans' huge relief, the hut proved not only to be intact, but it had also obviously recently been replenished. There was plenty of fresh hay and straw for the horses, and a plentiful supply of firewood was stacked against the stone wall next to the fireplace. Soon Lennard's kettle had boiled, and the 2 men and woman were seated at the table, weary hands gratefully cradling steaming mugs of hot, heavily sweetened herb tea. On the cooking grid, both of their large water-filled cooking pots were starting to steam gently. Around them, the hut was getting steadily warmer. Lennard got up first and walked across to where the Lound, now covered with the extra horse blanket as well, was still lying motionless on the mattress, except for the slow rise and fall of his side. As Dane and Anmar also stood up and followed him, he slipped a hand under the coverings and rested it gently on the Lound's side. When he straightened up, he spoke in a voice that reflected heartfelt relief. "Thank the benign presences. He is starting to feel much warmer. I was really concerned that he felt so cold earlier." Dane looked down at the Lound and said in a voice that reflected some puzzlement, "But what happened to him? He seemed fine, running ahead of us all, and the next moment here in the hut he's flaked out on the mattress, with you two obviously deeply concerned, hovering over him." Anmar looked at Lennard and then back at her brother. "As you are not a trained telepath yet, you probably didn't notice, Dane, but for the last hour at least of our journey, Zand was carrying us all. Didn't you notice that you felt a bit less tired and a bit more positive for the last hour or so of our journey?" Dane frowned again, then replied in a somewhat wondering voice, "Now that you mention it, I did feel better, but I just thought that it had got a bit less freezing." "No, Dane," Anmar replied, shaking her head. "It was Zand buoying us all up by projecting his mental strength into us. I tell you, it is highly unlikely that any of us would have made it to this hut if it wasn't for him." And in doing so, Lennard entered the conversation. He nearly burnt himself out, psychically and physically. Remember, he was tired himself, and his body had had very little time to benefit from the hurried and not very adequate meal he had had off our poor little pack horse, so he was hardly in the best of conditions to expend the amount of mind energy that he poured into all of us. Lennard bent down again and gently tucked a fold of the blanket more securely under the big neck. As he did so, his hand lingered briefly on the swathe of mane spilling onto the mattress behind the big head. He spoke in a quietly vehement tone of voice. "Confounded bloody beast literally nearly killed himself." His eyes were suspiciously bright when he straightened up. Wordlessly they returned to the table, where Anmar poured more herb tea into their mugs. Soon the water in the smaller of the 2 pots boiled. When she opened the bag of dried soup mixture that they were going to prepare for their supper, and got up to stir it into the pot of boiling water, Dane took the bag and the wooden spoon from her. "You sit down, sis. I'll do it." After modest bowls of the hot broth, they just took a few more moments to replenish the horses' feed and water troughs, piled the thickest logs they could find on the fire, and then collapsed onto their mattresses. But before he fell asleep, Lennard sent a muted mind probe to Zand. The Lound was deeply asleep, but Lennard's gentle quest, to his infinite relief, sensed none of the frantic and exhausted agitation of mind that he had detected earlier. As he withdrew, he felt just the faintest stirring in mind space, as Anmar's mind also quietly assessed the Lound's condition, and then slipped away with a similar aura of relief. Then she and Lennard gratefully followed Dane and the Lound into the healing reaches of sleep. They all, in essence, slept the day away. Dane got up once and put more wood on the fire. Lennard also woke once and did the same. He checked on Zand, and as the Lound was starting to feel quite hot, removed the horse blanket from him. Then he went back to his bed and immediate sleep in the quiet and fire-warmed hut. Lennard woke for the second time when the weak late afternoon sunshine slanted through one of the 2 small windows. As he sat up on his mattress, he noticed that Zand was no longer lying on his side, but was on top of the blanket in his usual position with head on paws. The bowl of water they had placed next to him was empty. As Lennard sat up, Anmar mind spoke. "I let him out just now. He seems to be all right." As Dane also stirred, Lennard asked aloud in a questioning voice, "Zand?" The Lound got up and made his usual unhurried way across to Lennard. The fierce eyes were unusually gentle as he stopped in front of the man, then rested a broad muzzle on his shoulder. Lennard spoke roughly as he hugged the heavy shoulders and gripped 2 handfuls of the thick mane in their accustomed gesture. "I was very worried about you." Zand sent a soothing murmur from a quiet and utterly relaxed mind. "Zand is fine now." He remained resting against Lhounds for a few moments longer, then stepped back. "But very, very hungry." Lhounds gave a short, relieved laugh and got up. "You deserve a large, fat, roasted pullet, which I promise to get you as soon as I can, but I am afraid that for now you'll have to settle for reheated broth and meal cakes," he said. He put more wood onto the fire and moved the pot of broth back onto the cooking grid and gave it a brisk stir. As Zand lay down on the blanket again, he projected with stoic resignation. "Zand will be grateful for anything." Anmar got up as well, then smilingly asked Lhounds, "Do you think a good brushing will make up for the humble fare that the poor creature has to put up with?" The speed with which Zand got to his feet and stood waiting expectantly gave eloquent answer. It was only later that evening that they were finally able to fully discuss and speculate about what had happened. Supper that evening had consisted of a very passable mutton and marrowroot stew, boiled barley rice, and a small handful each of nuts and deliciously sweet dried vine berries. After having cared for the horses that miraculously seemed to have taken no lasting harm from their ordeal, but were still very tired and sore, according to Zand, they replenished the fire again. Then, with the door again securely bolted, the sturdy exterior bamboo shutters similarly bolted on the inside, and the sash windows tightly closed and latched, the three humans sat down at the table with their accustomed brew of hot herb tea, whilst Zand lay down on his blanket and promptly went to sleep again. After a few moments of thoughtful silence, Dane rubbed his face. "So, what on earth do you think this whole business is about?" he said, looking from his sister to Lhounds and back again. "I've been racking my brain thinking about it as well," Anmar hesitantly replied. "And I've been wondering if it doesn't have something to do with that sender who was trying to break into our minds at the inn in Rickle," she concluded, though she was clearly not at all convinced of her own argument. "I mean," she continued, "he was really aggressive, the way he tried to smash his way into my mind. It was nothing like just a casual nosing about." Lhounds nodded. "I have done the same and come to more or less the same conclusion, but there is a great deal that I do not understand. I mean, how did this man, if it was him, find out enough about our mission to want to stop us, or even that we were going to Gordofane, and that we would be travelling across the plateaus? I thought you said that Zand shielded us from him that morning at breakfast." "I know, and this has been bothering me too," Anmar replied. "But I was wondering, what if he overheard us the evening before? I didn't see him that evening, but then I wasn't particularly on my guard or looking out for anybody, and we spoke very openly in your room that evening. If he had somehow got into either of the rooms next to yours and had one of those sound amplifiers that you hold against the wall, he could have heard every word that we spoke." They all exchanged appalled glances that slowly made way for some measure of grim acceptance. Then Dane broke the silence that had fallen as they all mentally digested what Anmar had said. "But no, wait," he said rather vehemently. "Why would he be so concerned about us getting to Gordofane and Queen Eruda? I mean, you don't just try to kill people because you don't like the look of their faces. Surely it takes some bloody strong motivation to go to such lengths as to actually decide to kill people. That is, if we assume that it really was a deliberate fire that burnt down that hut." "Oh, it was deliberate, all right," Lhounds retorted. "I could still smell the chem oil residue myself all over the burnt-out hut when we got there, and Zand wouldn't make a mistake like that. As to why he did it, I can only come to one inescapable conclusion. He has to be involved with whatever it is that's going on, the Lhounds disappearances, the strange rumors, whatever, and he does not want us to share our suspicions and the little bit that we know with Queen Eruda. I know it sounds far-fetched, but if there is another explanation, I certainly cannot think of it." Lhounds' frustration was evident as he impatiently drained the last of his herb tea. Anmar spoke hesitantly. "I don't suppose the chem oil could have been spilled accidentally." Lhounds shook his head. "I really doubt it. If that had happened, one would have expected the smell to have been concentrated in one area, and it wasn't. It was all over the hut. Zand checked very carefully, and I trust his sense of smell implicitly. No, I am totally convinced that the fire was set deliberately to get rid of us and stop us from getting to Gordofane. And you do realize that the person who burnt down the hut is almost certainly the man that Marcus thought was running away from something. The one who wouldn't have a day's rest at their way station, even though his horse was really tired and needed it. And if Anmar is right about that sender, and I am instinctively convinced that she is, then it almost certainly also means that the man who set fire to the hut and that powerful sender that we saw at the inn is more than likely one and the same person, and that he has been travelling ahead of us all this time." Both Anmar and Dane nodded thoughtfully, though both seemed understandably reluctant to accept this very unwelcome and indeed frightening fact. It was clear, however, that Lennard was also still conflicted in his thinking, as he continued, again in a tone of clear frustration. The one thing that makes me wonder whether I am right, though, is the question as to why he didn't destroy this hut as well. That would definitely have stopped any of us from ever reaching Gordofane. It simply doesn't make sense that he didn't. From his perspective, there was always the risk that at least some of us might have survived a night in the open. Not burning down this hut is like leaving a task only halfway completed. I do not believe for a moment that he belatedly developed moral scruples that stopped him. Anmar had been looking thoughtful for some moments, and now said, "Maybe something did stop him, Lennard. You remember that Oro mentioned that the crews who replenish the huts also sometimes stay over to do minor repairs? What if when he arrived here there were people working on the hut so that he didn't have the opportunity to set fire to it?" Lennard had been listening to her with close attention, and now he nodded thoughtfully, but with dawning decision. "You know, I think you are absolutely right. Look, it is clear that this place has been recently restocked. I mean, see all the new firewood and all the fresh hay and straw. And if you look at the door, the hinges in the outside section that the hinges are attached to are new. The door handle also looks as if it has been recently replaced." Yes, you're right," Dane interjected, with excitement creeping into his voice. "When I was closing the shutters earlier, I noticed that some of the bamboo slats have been replaced on 2 of them, and also that there are some new panes of Isonplex in both windows. You can feel that the pane sealant is still very soft. I got some on my fingers when I was opening the windows to bolt the shutters on the inside." Anmar nodded, but then frowned doubtfully. "But why didn't he just wait for them to leave? I don't think the work here would have taken that long, and he could always have pretended that he needed the rest." Lennard shook his head. No, he said decisively. "For whatever reason, he is in as big a hurry, if not an even greater hurry, than we are to get to Gordofane. I very much doubt that he would have wasted any time here. No, I am sure that he is long gone, pushing himself, and unfortunately his poor horse as well, to the limit to get to Gordofane well before us." After some further moments of reflection, both brother and sister sighed deeply and then agreed with him. Then Dane said, "Well, speaking for myself, I am delighted to know that he is no longer here. The thought that he might still be lurking around would not make me happy at all." "Nor me," Anmar replied soberly. "For quite frankly, if it is that sender, he terrifies me. The small glimpse that I had of his mind—" She sat quietly for a long moment, then shook her head and took a deep, slow breath. "I think that he is capable of almost anything. I fear that condemning people to die in a frozen wasteland is not the worst that he can do." They all exchanged glances, then sat in silence for some minutes, mulling over and trying to come to terms with the speculative but nonetheless deeply disquieting subject matter of their conversation. At last, Lennard got up and slapped his hands vigorously together. "Right, bed, everybody. We have been delayed long enough. Early start tomorrow." Within minutes the hut was dark and silent, except for quiet breathing and the faint crackle and shifting, eddying light of the replenished fire.